So as a part of a comprehensive plan, it is an effort typically looking out 20 years. It's a citywide look rather than a neighborhood specific or maybe downtown specific or corridor specific, like the community has embarked on. A lot of communities do. And it is setting policy. So that's distinct from regulation. So ideally, the policy is setting the stage for, it's a precursor to updating regulation, zoning districts, zoning standards, other development standards, and other city programs and initiatives to align with and implement that policy. So those are key pieces. Another element I would say is that we really want this to be a community-driven plan. So we had people show up at the first workshop at the beginning of March. We had some folks show up at the beginning of this workshop today. I was chatting with some people before we started. And they're saying, well, show me the plan. What's the plan? And well, we haven't developed the plan yet because we want to pull that out of the community process. Sessions like this, we're working with a steering committee throughout the process. I'll go over all of our different engagement efforts to date and some of those coming up. But there's online efforts, we're using social media, and we really want to get as many voices heard as possible. So again, that this is sort of the community's plan, it's community driven. We wanted to actually transcend city leadership. If you think about a 20-year period, there could be 10 different councils in place over that time. So we want it to be a guide for existing and future leadership throughout this process, something the community can point to, can hold up, and say this is our roadmap of how we want to grow, how we want to change, how we want to invest in the future. Included in that would be land use direction, elements around community character, urban design, the types of places we want to create, parks and open space, economic development, thinking about our housing. Who are we accommodating? Do we have housing that accommodates people, not just in the snapshot of right now, today, but families, households, individuals? They've really changed throughout the lifespan and have different needs. A lot of us probably have lived in an apartment. A lot of us have probably lived in a single family home. Some of us may have lived in a townhome or a condominium even. And so there's different needs at different stages of life, and we want to make sure that we're really accommodating people across the entire lifespan, from time of birth and kind of a family unit, and kind of going all the way through retirement and aging in place potentially, or maybe empty nesting and moving to a more vibrant kind of fun place as well. And then transportation planning and engineering being a key component as well. Our process update, this looks like we're really far along. That middle, I think those last two are wider just because the words are wider. But in fact, number 3 is probably the biggest kind of chunk here. So we're beginning this kind of dive into plan elements, beginning to think about recommendations in the plan. But that's going to sort of go all the way through early fall, kind of mid-fall period. And when we'll start to talk then about, okay, well, what of the recommendations, what are our priorities, and how do we implement those? And then ultimately, we'll be drafting the plan and trying to finalize that around the end of the year or early 2024. So a few updates. These are some of the things we've been doing over the last few months. So there was a citywide mailer that went out prior to that first workshop, which I remember seeing a few of you at. If you did not attend that, we have a great website which launched right around that same time, and all the materials from different meetings, whether it be the steering committee meetings or the community meetings like we're doing today, are posted on that city plan website. There's also background materials, previous plans that were developed, the 2010 plan, which is the current comprehensive plan that's on record. It has been updated since then a few times, but those are more minor updates. And so that kind of 2010 conversation that happened with the community is our current direction. That's available on there, as well as some existing conditions documents and analysis documents that we've developed. There is a community survey that launched on March 1st, and we are keeping that open through today. So if you haven't taken that survey yet, check out that link, the one that says SurveyMonkey in there. There's a QR code towards the end of the presentation as well. But that'll be open through the end of the day, so you still have an opportunity to take that if you'd like, or promote it to a friend. We did community meetings in early March, as I mentioned, and then we had a virtual open house that launched as well. So the website, as I mentioned, has all these different features on there, really nicely designed and organized. It's kind of a one-stop shop for the project. We'll keep adding things there, so please check back. The virtual open house is pretty cool. It's kind of similar to attending this in person, but you can do it on your phone, you can do it on a tablet, do it on your computer. You can actually go into this sort of virtual space, move around, look around, interact with the boards, put Post-its on them just like you would here. And Emily's on there to explain all the different stations. And then that survey that I mentioned, we have had an amazing response already. Over 2,000 participants in the survey through April 27th, so that's probably even a little higher now. About 62% of those respondents have actually lived in Amarillo for more than 20 years. A really amazing statistic. So I think something different than we see in a lot of communities. So I think that's it's sort of telling me two things. One, there's a lot of longtime residents in Amarillo, maybe more so than in some communities. And then those longtime residents are really active in sort of expressing what they want to see in the future. And then 90% of folks live within the city limits. We have a really good age distribution thus far, with between 16 and 20% across all the different age ranges, with the exception of 24 or younger, which is about 9%, which again, looking at our stats across different communities, that's actually a pretty good representation of that younger community. There is, well, as I mentioned, we're keeping that open through today, and we've been promoting it through a lot of different avenues. A few highlights. We're going to be doing a more detailed analysis of this. We'll be putting together a report, putting that on the website within probably about 2 to 3 weeks from today when the survey closes. But we've pulled a couple of things, and so these numbers might change a little bit, but I don't think that the kind of priority will change. So top 3 preferred investments over the next 20 years. 63% favor maintaining existing roads, utilities, and other critical infrastructure. So in essence, taking care of what we have being a high priority. 45% favoring maintaining and improving existing parks and open space. So again, taking care of some of the kind of recreational amenities and open space amenities, again, that we already have. And then 45% promoting improvements of aging neighborhoods, homes, yards, and sidewalks. So thinking about just where we're spending the community's dollars, the emphasis so far via the survey is on existing infrastructure, existing amenities, and existing neighborhoods. Top 3 preferred ways Amarillo should grow in the next 20 years. 63% favor redevelopment of older, rundown areas to develop mixed income neighborhoods close to existing amenities. 51% favor infill development on vacant sites with new housing and commercial uses. 50% favor developing additional walkable centers and other places that provide shopping, dining, and employment close to where people live. And then the bottom one there, top 3 priorities that must be addressed to ensure success for Amarillo over the next 20 years in kind of descending order: affordability, aging infrastructure, and economic development. So as you're sort of interacting with the boards and the staff that will be participating with you all and engaging you in conversation, kind of keep these in mind as far as the overall community sentiment, but we want to hear from you as well. If you agree with these sort of directions that we're hearing via the survey, if you have differing opinions, or if you want to sort of advance these ideas, we're welcome to all of those. We have met with a steering committee a couple of times, including last night. They're sort of moving along in the process, either right along with the community or maybe a step ahead, just to help us kind of vet, test ideas, provide some direction, interpretation of what we heard in the community conversation. But again, those meetings are open to the public. We're putting the materials on the website, so we invite you to track along with that process as well. We've been doing some pop-up events at different community meetings. So far, the East Ridge Neighborhood Vet Vaccine pop-up and NAACP meeting. And then coming up, there's 5 towards the end of May and beginning of June. So we hope to see you at some of those. And then there's additional engagement. There's been some student outreach. There's a student-specific version of the survey that was created, which we've been getting great response to. Did this student video with Amy, the Amarillo armadillo, as you can see in the right here. And then we have a website landing page corresponding with that. We're using social media and using email to get the word out. So again, Joy and her team are doing an awesome job raising awareness, and we hopefully are seeing an uptick in actual sort of engagement and participation as we move throughout the process as well. So our objectives for this afternoon, I think, yes, we are afternoon now. We are introducing a couple of our initial plan elements. So if you attended the first meeting, this may sound familiar to you, but a little reminder for folks, or maybe it's new information for new people in the process. But a comprehensive plan, there is a formula to that. The state of Texas actually has statutes around the elements that would be required in a comprehensive plan, as well as some of those that could be added. There's also templates from around the country. Obviously, we emphasize and prioritize the Texas direction, but we can take some inspiration from comprehensive planning from other places as well. So each element of a plan is a topic area. Usually a comprehensive plan is organized then by those topic areas or elements. So you could kind of think about them as chapters of the plan. And so the first two chapters or elements that we'll be tackling beginning today are land use and community character. So what can happen where in terms of residential, housing, thinking about employment of different types, retail and commercial, open space. Those are considered land uses. So what can happen where? And then community character, really importantly, sort of what are the types of places we're creating? What is the built form of a place? Does it encourage and support the use of the automobile? Does it encourage support walking around, walking to your local destinations? Does it encourage social sort of community building or not? And so those are aspects of community character. And then importantly, housing and neighborhoods. It makes up a really large portion of the land area of Amarillo already, and we anticipate more need moving forward. And so what do we want in terms of housing, how we're accommodating different needs moving forward, and what do the neighborhoods look like that are comprising that housing. Place types. I'm going to introduce this. It's an important concept that we're working on as part of this planning process to really advance the conversation beyond just what can happen where in terms of the uses, beginning to think and incorporate that community character into that conversation, and then begin to layer in things like the transportation network, the utilities, the infrastructure, the amenities, to make sure that we're not creating places that aren't supported by the necessary infrastructure or not connected to the places nearby. And then finally, we want community feedback. So we have this open house set up that we'll break into after the presentation. So those first two plan elements, the first one, land use and community character, we'll be looking at the assessment of land use consistency. What that means is looking at what exists on the ground, what is the community's kind of preferred direction, is that matching up? Is it aligning with market forces? If it's not aligning with market demand or market support, what can the city do, what can the community do to help to shape that, to craft that, to really fit the community's vision? We're going to be looking at existing community character, which we fully acknowledge is not the same across the entire footprint of the city. We have different characters in different places, and we want to try to capture those subtleties in the direction that we'll provide in the plan, whether that be detailed direction in the place types or in some of the maps, or at a higher level policy direction. Assessing potential impacts to that character within growth scenarios. So how do we either support and enhance the community character in different places, or how are we transforming that in the way that the community desires with the different growth scenarios, developing a preferred growth scenario, and then establishing supporting policies. A reminder from our last community workshop, and if folks looked at the existing conditions online, if you haven't looked at it, you can check that out on the project website. But looking over the last 20 years, Amarillo has grown by about 16%. The state of Texas has grown even faster. One of the steering committee members pointed out last night, perhaps that has to do with some of the sort of, if you look across the entire state, a lot of growth outside of cities, actually, in sort of unincorporated county areas. So asked us to maybe do a deeper dive in that. So that's some information we can bring back next time. Looking forward, though, from 2020, so a couple of years ago, and this is in the first column on the lower table there. You can use this guy here. Looking out to 2040, which is our planning horizon for this effort, or 2045. And so really thinking about kind of this 2040, 2050 time period. Amarillo could grow based on some state demographer projections by 44,000 to up to 70,000 people by 2050. So where are those people going to work? Where are they going to live? How are, as we're making those investments, whether it be private sector investments, public sector investments, how are those investments really benefiting not just the new folks, but everyone who lives here already? How are we improving the entire community, thinking about the growth that will occur? At the last meeting, we had presented the existing land use map. Again, this is available in the existing conditions report. But what this really shows, it just visually, is that the red and the yellow on that map account for an awful lot of the land area of the community. That represents the yellow being residential, different neighborhoods, and the red being commercial properties. The other thing that probably jumps out is this public and institutional. And then along, it's a little harder to see on this small map. We do have it blown up over here on the left-hand side of the room. But there's also industrial along some of our corridors. And so those make up a big area of the community today. Do we want that to continue? Do we want those to evolve, improve in some way? Or do we actually want to see some new development or redevelopment in some of those areas? We then have a future land use map. This is kind of the working direction that exists today. This is from the 2010 plan. The future land use map has not been updated since 2010. So this is a 13-year-old kind of direction that was set through this community conversation that happened 13 years ago. And that's showing even larger, including that airport, which was designated as institutional on the other map, industrial area in this kind of south, or sort of eastern wedge, of the community. Again, a large residential kind of cluster on a little bit to the north, but really on the west and southwest. We have the designation of sort of the commercial and sort of urban center kind of designation in the middle here. But you can begin to see, I would say beyond the downtown kind of city center area, we really have a corridor style of development, looking at major intersections as opportunities in that future land use map, and some of our major corridors being called out as well. And so again, I think it's important to know what the direction was previously, where we are today, and to kind of think about where we want to go moving forward. We're not sort of approaching this as if we're, have a blank slate. We want to work with what exists in the community today and what some of those prior community conversations included. I won't hit all of these bullets in the bottom, but just a few things to call out. There was an emphasis in the 2010 plan on creating more walkable kind of urban centers. That's represented in the future land use map around a lot of those intersections that I called out in the kind of pink color. You can see that on the right-hand map. That's a repeat of the one on the last slide. So you're starting to see those. So in the newer parts of town, I would say that's a lot easier to achieve, right? So you might have the roads, but it's not developed yet. And so you can actually designate what you would want in the different spots. When we're thinking about existing parts of the community, which is the vast majority of the community, is older than 20, 30 years old, how do we retrofit some of those areas? Or do we need to take a more creative approach to achieve the similar intent? So that's some of the important input we'll be looking for today in tonight's session and moving forward over the next couple of months. We do have some misalignment in terms of where some of those urban centers are designated in terms of what's there now. A lot of places it's institutional or commercial, which that could be sort of maybe evolve into some of those places. Pretty good commercial area designation, as I said, mainly corridor oriented. And then a good alignment between what exists today and the future land use map from 2010 when we're looking at some of the residential and commercial uses. Some of the input we heard from the last round of workshops, there was some concern about the mixing of residential and commercial uses. Wanting to make sure that that was not intruding on neighborhoods. So that if it could be done in a way where it was enhancing neighborhoods, creating better access, yes. But we don't want it to be detrimental to the neighborhood character or feel. Interest in redeveloping some of the brownfield sites that exist, so thinking about adaptive reuse, primarily of some of the industrial areas or maybe heavier commercial uses, supporting strategic infill in different locations, addressing older parts of the community, and really trying to work with what we have as much as possible, rather than what some people expressed was sort of an approach, let's move on or beyond what we have already and just think about building new, which tends to be on the edges of the community. So not to say that there won't be additional development on the edges of the community over the next 20 years, but how can we balance that? Again, I'm sort of reflecting some of the community sentiment from the last round and some of the initial input we heard on the survey. How can we balance that with some emphasis and support of existing parts of the community? On the housing and neighborhoods chapter, thinking about amenity-based neighborhoods, what does that look like? Can those amenities be different in different places? How do we increase access to those amenities and some of the existing things that do exist? And how do we enhance existing housing in neighborhoods? This map shows the change in housing units in different places across the community. So the blues and the darker blues, which might be looking like black, but that's a dark navy blue. Those are places where we had the most housing growth over the last about 50 years. Then the light blue would kind of be next. It shows a lot of growth out here because these are bigger kind of census areas. While there was a lot of growth out here, 200 to about 1,000, it's spread across this larger area versus these, which are smaller geographies. And then the orange areas on the map actually saw a decline in housing units. So housing units either most of them actually being removed because of the condition they were in or redevelopment that had occurred. This is showing other types of growth across the community. These are building permits. So you can see a lot of that spread across the community, largely along corridors in the kind of the northern half of the community, and then really a large focus on all different types of development in the southwest. And some of the things that we heard in the last round of workshops, people want more housing diversity in downtown. They feel like that would help sort of enliven the downtown, but also as a good place to add more housing, particularly if we're thinking about different housing types than exist today across the community. Providing assistance to improve existing housing, so new roofs, new siding, new windows, improvements to yards. Stabilizing existing neighborhoods that are still intact. Thinking about some of those neighborhoods where there have been a lot of demolitions. What is the future of those neighborhoods? Is there a new vision for those? And it may still have a strong residential component, but does it look different moving forward? Ensuring that all neighborhoods have access to shopping, services, and recreation. And again, reflecting what we heard in some of those post-it notes, starting to discourage some of the new housing outside of the city limits. I did not edit this since our steering committee meeting last night, which included the same slide. The feedback there was, well, how do you do that exactly? Maybe we need to think about the flip side of that and encouraging more investment inside the city and being a more probably feasible and advantageous approach. Okay, so last little piece here, and then we'll open up for some questions and comments before opening it up to the larger open house. This idea of place type. So a lot of the stuff that you're going to see around the room today, a lot of the things that we'll be developing over the next few months and presenting at the next community workshop in the fall, working with the steering committee on, you'll see it in surveys coming up, is around this idea of place types. So in a typical, I guess I'll leave it back here for a second. In a typical comprehensive plan, if you look at the existing comprehensive plan for Amarillo, if you look at probably 7, 8, even 9 out of 10 comprehensive plans that were developed over the last 20 to 30 years, they have a future land use map, which is, as I mentioned, a really helpful tool when you're thinking about zoning decisions, day to day. If we're thinking about rezoning potentially a parcel or an area of the community. But where it falls short is when we're thinking about the types of places that we want to create in the community, it's not just is it residential or is it commercial or is it industrial. A lot of it has to do with the style of development. Is it a lot of single-story buildings that are separated and, across large lots. And so what happens there is you end up with a lower density overall. It takes more land to accommodate the same number of employees. Similar thing could be said for residents with the approach to housing. And it costs more to serve that in terms of infrastructure. Am I saying that's bad? No, not at all. If that's something that the community wants, then we just need to be aware of the costs associated with that. But what we've been hearing so far in the process is that people want that plus more diversity. They want to balance that with other things that may actually be closer together, that may promote walkability, that may not require getting in your car for every trip, or may actually save the taxpayers dollars when it comes to building infrastructure, providing utilities to support those places. So again, it's going to be a mixed, balanced approach based on what we've been hearing so far, but we invite your input today and moving forward to really make sure we're getting that right through this process. Place types then are a tool for us to have that conversation. They do address land use, but they think about not just a single land use on each parcel. They think about kind of larger geographies and how they may have a mix of uses actually. And then what is that building form that goes with that? What are the transportation needs of an area or a place? And what is a public space and open space to support that? And how do we transition from one place to the next? That's actually a big rub usually in a planning process, in a rezoning process potentially, which hopefully would, it's an implementation step of a plan like this. And so how do we ensure that we're having the right adjacencies between different places and then have the right policy direction to make sure that those are conducive and to good community character and not providing nuisances. So we have 4 categories of place types. The first are neighborhood place types. And these probably will look the most familiar in terms of, I think because they are largely residential in nature, they mirror most one of the existing future land use designations, which in the current map, there is a residential low and a residential medium category. We're talking about neighborhoods because we want to include the small parks, the plazas, the street network, the trails potentially that connect these places. And so neighborhood low, neighborhood medium, and neighborhood high. We have those over in the corner of the room. There'll be an opportunity to provide or look at these in more detail. But I'm not going to walk through what each of them are, but just what's included on every place type board. We talk about a purpose. We have what are some of the primary land uses we would expect and encourage there. What are some of the secondary land uses that we'd see? So again, it's not just a single land use. It's a set of land uses that work well together to create a place. Looking at potential housing densities, job densities, mobility characteristics, parking, parks and open space, and these transitions between places. The next category of place types is mixed use. So a mixed use place could be along a corridor, more linear, or it could actually be kind of a district, or maybe not district, that's confusing because we have other districts here. They would be kind of dimensional, several blocks by several blocks. So a neighborhood mixed use would be kind of smallest in scale and typically serve the smallest area as well, smallest geography. A community mixed use area would actually serve multiple neighborhoods, maybe the east side or the west side. And someone might drive across town, but typically you'd have multiple community mixed use areas distributed around the community so that you'd have one relatively close to home. And then a regional mixed use, in most communities, that's the downtown. And it continues to be the kind of singular regional mixed use place. We have worked on certain communities where they've said, you know what, we actually want to start envisioning a new regional mixed use place, not to displace the downtown or compete with the downtown, but perhaps complement that in some way. So far we haven't heard that in Amarillo, but if that emerges from the process, we obviously would be open to looking at a scenario that includes that. Third category of place types are districts. So that would include a commercial district. That again is probably a lot of what's on the ground when we think about retail, employment across Amarillo today. We'd probably classify that as commercial. But we also do have some examples of campuses, educational campuses, civic campuses, medical campuses. We could also see office parks being kind of fitting in that campus designation. So those are places, again, that kind of work internally for themselves. Typically have parking on the edges, internal walkability, some open spaces connecting them. An innovation place type, probably the least prevalent in Amarillo today. But we're seeing examples across the country of typically older industrial areas or older commercial areas of other types that sort of are evolving. They're sort of, people are breathing new life into them and making them these places for kind of cool condominiums or apartments, creative office space, perhaps maker space, which would be kind of smaller fabrication, kind of smaller businesses that are kind of testing out ideas. So this kind of idea of an innovation place. We want to test, see, is that something that the folks in Amarillo want to see more of or want to see, and where would that go? And with all of these place types, this is an initial kind of set that we're putting out there for feedback. We could change these, we could omit some of them, delete them all together, we could add to this list, but we're kind of testing these ideas. The fourth and final of this third category of district place types would be manufacturing and logistics, which include manufacturing, kind of larger scale business parks. Some may have some limited retail services, but also include processing, fabrication, and distribution. Final place type category would be include parks and open space and reserve. So reserve would be areas that we're saying over the next 20 years, we don't see that developing. We're keeping in reserve potentially as open space in perpetuity, or maybe it's helping to accommodate some of the growth that would be expected over the next 20 years from 2045 to 2065. And parks and open space, I didn't mention it, but each of those other places that we talked about, the place types, we would actually expect them to include small parks, open space. I mentioned trail connectivity, but there are parks that are of a scale that's large enough, like Rick Klein, for instance, that we could kind of think about as their own place, right? They're not supporting one neighborhood or one district. They're really a regional destination. And so we would want to map those in our preferred scenario and the alternative scenarios that we'll use to get there. So the only map that we've created with using these place types so far is what we're calling the current growth scenario. So while we have a future land use map from the 2010 comprehensive plan that sets some policy direction, again, hasn't been updated in 13 years, we do have zoning mapped across the entire community. And in essence, what zoning does, a zoning district, if you looked at the zoning code, it talks about the permissible uses. There's some uses in there that are considered conditional, meaning you'd have to get permission to do those, but you could do those potentially. And then it has a bunch of development standards. So those would be the type of tool that we'd use to implement a desired place type. So we said, okay, well, given the existing direction that's on the books today, the existing zoning, if we translated that to this palette of place types, what might that look like? And that's what the current growth scenario is. We wanted to use that as a baseline as we're inviting you all to provide more input on what you'd like to see in terms of where these place types might go, how certain places might change, and what alternatives we want to explore moving forward. We'll be using those to create at least 3 alternative scenarios to the kind of current direction that's provided by zoning. And then we'll do quantitative comparisons of those in terms of how much of that is using brand new land versus existing land, how many housing units could be accommodated, how many jobs are created through the different scenarios, as well as some other maybe environmental factors, kind of indicators, greenhouse gas emissions associated with the different scenarios, looking at vehicle miles traveled, so how much would people have to drive, how much would we have to spend on new roads, different things like that. We'll bring back to the community to compare different scenarios based on the input you're providing today, what we hear tonight, and over the next few weeks in terms of getting online input as well. We did prepare a few case studies, which you'll be able to see in the kind of towards the entrance over there. So highlighting at least one of the place types in each of those categories. So some actual development that has occurred in different places around the country for the most part. We have a California example, a Utah example, and a couple of Texas examples within there. So check those out and provide input on what you like and don't like about those potential case studies, if they are or are not applicable to Amarillo, and if there's certain lessons learned or aspects of them that might be worth exploring.